For 9 winters, the Duke of Thistlewood set a place at his table every single evening for a guest who never came, because his own sister had once been called worthless and turned from that same table, and had died before he found the courage to invite her back. He did not know, the winter he finally filled that chair, that the young woman sitting in it had been called the very same word, by the very same kind of quiet cruelty, every day of her life since she was 11 years old. Alice Norwood had been called worthless so many times in her life that the word had stopped landing as an insult and settled instead into something closer to a fact, the way one accepts that winter is cold or that certain roads flood after heavy rain. It was simply the shape of the world she had been born into, and she had learned, over 11 years, to arrange herself around it the way a plant learns to grow around a stone it cannot move. It had not always been said cruelly. That, she thought, was the particular genius of her stepmother's cruelty. It rarely raised its voice, rarely struck, rarely did anything a servant or a visitor might report as unkind. It arrived instead in small, deniable sentences, delivered with the same mild patience one might use to correct a child's posture. "You are a considerable expense for a girl who contributes so little, Alice," Lady Beatrice would say, refilling her own teacup without offering one to her stepdaughter, "though I suppose someone must feed you, whatever the cost." Or, more simply, over some minor domestic failure that was never actually Alice's fault. "I sometimes wonder what your father saw fit to leave me, taking on a child worth so little in return for the burden of raising her." Alice's father had died when she was 11, leaving a modest estate and a new wife who had married him only 18 months prior, and in the 11 years since, Alice had learned the precise choreography required to survive a house where she was tolerated rather than wanted. She made herself small. She spoke only when addressed. She ate whatever was left after her stepmother and her stepmother's own daughter, Priscilla, 3 years Alice's junior, had taken their fill, and she had learned, long ago, not to expect there to be much left. She had also learned, with the quiet, patient logic of someone who had spent a decade being told she was a debt owed rather than a person loved, that the accusation of worthlessness could never actually be answered, because answering it required someone, at some point, to give her the chance to be useful and simply watch what she did with it. No one ever had. It was easier, Alice understood, to call a person worthless than to test the claim, because testing it risked discovering it was false, and a false accusation, once made 100 times, becomes considerably more comfortable to believe than to retract. The letter that changed everything arrived on an ordinary Tuesday in late October, addressed not to Lady Beatrice, but to Alice directly, in a hand she did not recognize, small, precise, unhurried. "Miss Norwood," it read, "I am given to understand, through my late aunt's correspondence with your late mother some years past, that you are the daughter of Margaret Norwood, whom my aunt held in considerable regard. I find myself, this winter, in want of a companion for my own elderly aunt, Lady Prudence Wren, who resides at Thistlewood, and requires a steady, sensible young woman to assist her through the darker months. The position offers a modest salary and full board. I would welcome your acceptance, should the arrangement suit you, and would ask that you write to confirm at your earliest convenience. Marcus Wren, Duke of Thistlewood." Alice read it 3 times before she understood it was truly addressed to her, and not to some other Alice Norwood entirely. Lady Beatrice, when she learned of the letter, Alice had not hidden it, understanding correctly that hiding it would only make its eventual discovery worse. read it with the particular flat expression she wore when calculating whether something served her interests. "A duke, writing to you directly," she said slowly. "How very strange. He mentions my mother, madam, some correspondence with his aunt. Your mother has been dead 11 years, Alice. I hardly think a duke's aunt has spent that time pining over letters from a woman she likely met twice in passing." Lady Beatrice folded the letter and set it down with the particular precision she brought to everything. "Still, a position is a position, and a duke's household will feed you considerably better than mine has patience to, given how little use you are around here besides. You may go." It was, Alice understood, the closest her stepmother had ever come to simply admitting she wished her gone, though the sentiment arrived, as it always did, dressed in the language of practicality rather than cruelty. She packed her single trunk that same evening, folding in the few things that were truly hers: 3 worn dresses, her mother's small silver thimble on its ribbon, a handful of letters her father had written her before his death, kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard for 11 years, because Lady Beatrice had made clear, early on, that sentiment for a dead man's first wife was not welcome in her house. Priscilla found her packing and stood in the doorway with the particular smug curiosity of a younger sister who had spent her whole life being told, in contrast to every quiet cruelty Alice endured, that she herself was the treasure of the household. "A duke wants you as a companion for an old woman," Priscilla said, not quite hiding her disbelief. "I confess, I cannot imagine why. You have nothing to recommend you, Alice. No dowry, no accomplishments worth mentioning, no particular beauty." "Perhaps," Alice said, folding her last dress with careful, steady hands, "he does not require any of those things in a companion for his aunt. Perhaps he requires only someone willing to sit with an old woman through the winter, which I am considerably well practiced at doing for people who value me very little." Priscilla did not have an answer for that, and Alice, for the first time in longer than she could remember, felt something that was not quite hope, but was not entirely its absence either. The carriage that carried Alice to Thistlewood was hired plainly, arranged and paid for, she was informed by the driver, entirely by the Duke's own solicitor, and it deposited her at the estate's gates on a cold, clear evening in early November, the sky already deepening toward the particular blue-black of a northern winter dusk. Thistlewood rose before her in solid grey stone, not grand in the way of a palace, but substantial in the way of a house that had stood through several centuries and intended to stand through several more. Every window on the ground floor was lit, and smoke curled steady from 6 chimneys, and Alice, climbing down from the carriage with her single trunk in hand, found herself pausing simply to look at it. A house that seemed, even from the gravel drive, to be expecting her. She was met at the door by a housekeeper, a broad, warm-faced woman named Mrs. Aldous, who took one look at Alice's thin cloak and pale, tired face and made a small clicking sound of disapproval before she had even properly introduced herself. "You'll be Miss Norwood, then," Mrs. Aldous said, ushering her inside out of the cold with brisk efficiency. "His Grace said you'd be arriving this evening. Come in, come in. You're half frozen. Lady Prudence is already abed for the night, but she'll be glad of your company come morning. Dinner's not long off. You'll want to warm through before it's served." Alice, who had expected, at best, to be shown directly to a servant's room and told to present herself the following morning, found herself instead being led toward the main dining room, and she paused in the corridor, uncertain. "I would not wish to intrude on His Grace's dinner, Mrs. Aldous. I am a companion, not a guest. I can take a tray in my room, if that is more proper." Mrs. Aldous looked at her with an expression Alice could not quite read. His Grace dines with the household most evenings, Miss Norwood, when there's no company to stand on ceremony for. He'll expect you at the table. Come along now. The dining room, when Alice entered it, was smaller than she had expected of a duke's house. Warm, wood-panelled, a fire burning steady in the hearth, a table set for perhaps 6, though Alice understood, from what little Mrs. Aldous had said, that the household at present numbered considerably fewer than that. The Duke of Thistlewood stood as she entered. He was tall, dark-haired, with silver just beginning at his temples, his brown eyes settling on her with a quiet, careful attention that Alice, in 11 years of being looked past, rather than looked at, did not entirely know how to receive. "Miss Norwood," he said, "I am glad you arrived safely. The roads this time of year can be treacherous, Your Grace." She dropped a careful curtsy. "Thank you for the position. I confess, I am still uncertain why you thought of me at all, given how distant the connection to my mother must be." "We will speak of that in time, if you wish it," he said. "For now, please, sit. You must be tired from the journey." Alice looked at the table and understood, in the space of a single glance, why it had been laid for 6. 2 places were clearly meant for the Duke and for Lady Prudence, whom she had not yet met. A third, she assumed, was meant for her, but there were 2 further places set, full settings, plate and glass and cutlery, arranged with the same careful precision as the others, with no one seated before them, and no indication anyone was expected. "Your Grace," she said carefully, taking the seat Mrs. Aldous indicated, "am I mistaken, or are there places set for guests who are not present this evening?" Something moved across his face, not quite discomfort, something closer to a man deciding, in the moment, how much of himself to share with a stranger on her very first evening under his roof. "There is one place set for my aunt, Lady Prudence, who is presently abed and will join us tomorrow," he said. "And one place," he continued more slowly, "that I keep set every evening, whether or not anyone is expected to fill it." Alice looked at the empty chair at the foot of the table. A good chair, well cared for, its place setting arranged with the same attention as every other, and felt, without entirely understanding why, that she had stumbled into something considerably more significant than an ordinary household habit. "May I ask why, Your Grace?" He was quiet a long moment, his fingers moving, she noticed, to straighten the fork at that empty place, setting by a fraction of an inch. A small, unconscious gesture that told her, more than any answer could, how deeply the habit ran. "I had a sister," he said finally, "Eleanor. 9 years ago, my father turned her from this very table and called her worthless in front of the whole assembled family, because she had given her heart to a man he considered beneath our station. I was 26, and I did not have the courage, that evening or in the months that followed, to stand against him and invite her back. She died the following winter, of a fever, in a small rented room 3 counties distant, still estranged, still uninvited." His hand rested, briefly, over the empty chair's high back. "I have kept a place set at this table every night since, Miss Norwood, for anyone the world has seen fit to call worthless. I could not save my sister's chair from being emptied once. I find I cannot bear the thought of anyone else being turned from this table the way she was." Alice sat very still, her own worn ribbon and its small silver thimble hidden beneath the cuff of her sleeve, and felt something in her chest crack open in a way she had not permitted it to in 11 long years. "Your Grace," she said, when she trusted her voice. "I believe I understand that habit rather better than you might expect." He looked at her then, properly, the careful social distance in his gaze softening into something closer to genuine curiosity. "Tell me, if you are willing." And so, over a dinner she had expected to eat alone in some small back room, Alice Norwood found herself, for the first time in 11 years, telling another person the full and plain truth of what her stepmother's house had called her, every day, in 100 small and deniable ways, and finding, to her own considerable astonishment, that the man across the table did not flinch from it, did not offer easy comfort, but simply listened, with the same quiet, careful attention he had given the empty chair his sister once should have filled. If you have ever been told, quietly and repeatedly, that you were a burden rather than a blessing, comment the empty chair below, because what Alice discovers over the following weeks at Thistlewood is the reason this house finally learns what her own never once thought to teach her. Lady Prudence Wren, when Alice met her properly the following morning, proved to be a sharp-eyed, quick-tongued woman of 72, confined largely to her rooms by a weakness in her joints that had worsened considerably the previous winter, but entirely undiminished in wit or observation. "So you're the girl my nephew has taken it into his head to rescue," Lady Prudence said, by way of greeting, from her chair by the window. "Sit down, girl. Don't hover. I cannot abide hovering." Alice sat, carefully, in the chair indicated. "I do not believe His Grace intended a rescue, my lady. I understood the position to be a genuine need for a companion. Did you?" Lady Prudence's sharp eyes moved over her, the thin frame, the careful stillness, the worn cuffs of her traveling dress. "Marcus has kept that ridiculous chair set at his table for 9 years, girl, for a sister he failed to save, and has never once in all that time actually filled it with a living person until you arrived. I would not call that mere practicality. I would call that a man finally ready to stop merely grieving and start actually doing something useful with the habit." Alice did not know how to answer that, and so she did what she had learned to do best, over 11 years of surviving a house that did not particularly want her. She made herself useful instead of remarkable, and asked, simply, what Lady Prudence required of her that morning. It became, over the following weeks, the shape of her days at Thistlewood. Mornings with Lady Prudence, reading aloud, managing correspondence. The old woman's failing eyes could no longer easily manage herself, listening to sharp, funny, occasionally cutting observations about the county's gentry that made Alice laugh more in a single week than she had in the previous several years combined. Afternoons, increasingly, found her in the small estate office, where she had noticed, on her 3rd day, that the household accounts were kept in a hand that suggested haste rather than incompetence, and had offered, tentatively, to help reconcile a column that did not appear to balance. She did not offer this the way she might once have in her stepmother's house, apologetically, bracing for correction. She offered it plainly, the way a person offers a genuine skill, and found, to her quiet astonishment, that Marcus accepted the help without hesitation, and without the faint, careful condescension she had come to expect whenever anyone acknowledged she might be capable of something. "You have a gift for numbers, Miss Norwood," he said one afternoon, watching her correct a column of figures with the same quick, sure hand she brought to everything she had learned, over the years, not to expect praise for. "My father taught me, before he died," Alice said. "He said a woman who understood her own household's accounts could never be entirely at the mercy of anyone else's version of the truth." She hesitated. My stepmother did not share his view. She said the habit was unbecoming and unnecessary for a girl of my, She used a particular word, Your Grace. Prospects. She meant I had none worth the trouble of educating. And yet here you sit, Marcus said, correcting the Duke's ledgers with a precision his own steward has never once managed. Here I sit, Alice agreed, and found, saying it aloud, that something in her had shifted since arriving at Thistlewood. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, the way a room warms when a fire has been burning steadily, rather than lit and quickly extinguished. It was during her 4th week that she noticed the particular way Marcus favored his left side after long hours on horseback, a small stiffness he never mentioned and clearly did not wish remarked upon, and began, without asking, to have the study fire built up higher on the evenings she knew he'd ridden the tenant farms that day. She noticed he ate very little, unless someone sat with him at meals, the old habit, she suspected, of a man who had spent too many years dining alone with only an empty chair for company. She began, without being asked, to simply be present at dinner each evening, rather than retreating to take a tray with Lady Prudence, and watched, over the following weeks, as the careful, guarded stillness in his face, at the start of each meal, gradually, quietly, began to ease. He noticed her in turn, the way she counted silently under her breath, before answering a difficult question, and asked her about it gently one evening, without judgment, the way he seemed to ask about everything that mattered to him. It steadies my hands, Alice admitted. An old habit, from years of being asked questions where the wrong answer cost something. I count to 5. It gives me time to be certain before I speak. Do you need to count now? Marcus asked quietly. Alice considered the question honestly. Less than I did my first week here, she said. Considerably less than I did in my stepmother's house at all. He did not say anything to that directly, but she noticed, in the days that followed, that he began asking her opinion on small household matters with a particular patience, waiting through her silent counting, without hurrying her, without the faint impatience she had learned to expect from anyone who had ever bothered to ask her anything at all. It was Mrs. Aldous who told her, quite by accident one evening, the fuller shape of what she had only half understood her first night at Thistlewood. His Grace had that chair moved once, you know, the housekeeper mentioned, setting down a fresh pot of tea in the small sitting room where Alice sat mending a torn hem by the fire. Some years back, before you came, tried to have it taken to the attics with the other unused furniture, thinking perhaps it was time to let the habit go. Brought it back down himself within the hour, said the room felt wrong without it, though he wouldn't say more than that. And now, Alice asked carefully, now that the chair is filled? Now, Mrs. Aldous said, with a small, knowing smile Alice did not yet fully understand. I imagine he'll never once think of moving it again. The letter arrived in mid-December, addressed to Alice in Lady Beatrice's precise, familiar hand, and Alice read it standing in the front hall, her own hands unsteady, in a way she had not felt since her first week at Thistlewood. Alice, your father's estate, as you well know, comes to you in part upon your marriage or your 25th birthday. I have managed the trust responsibly these 11 years on your behalf, and I write now to inform you that certain expenses of the household, Priscilla's coming season chief among them, require an advance against your eventual portion. I have already written to the trustees requesting the release of a modest sum. Your signature is required to formalize the arrangement. I trust you will not be difficult about a matter that has, after all, cost me considerably more in raising you than it will ever return. Alice read it 3 times, the old familiar chill of obligation settling over her, and found, to her own surprise, that beneath the chill sat something else entirely. A small, steady spark of anger she did not recognize, because she had never before been permitted to feel it without immediately smothering it. She brought the letter to Marcus that same evening, in the study, and watched his expression harden as he read it. "You have an inheritance," he said slowly. "One your stepmother has managed for 11 years. "I did not know the particulars," Alice admitted. "She told me, always, that my father left very little, and that whatever small sum existed was already spent on my keep." I believed her. I had no reason not to. "Do you have any record of the trust's true terms?" Alice thought of the loose floorboard in her old room, the letters kept hidden there for 11 years. "My father wrote to me once before his death, describing what he intended to leave me, in case anything should happen to him before I came of age. I kept the letter. I do not know if it carries any legal weight, but it exists, in his own hand." "Then we shall find out what weight it carries," Marcus said, "before your stepmother extracts a single shilling from a fortune she has spent 11 years telling you did not exist." Lady Beatrice arrived at Thistlewood herself 2 weeks later, unannounced, her travelling coach pulling up the long drive on a bitter, clear afternoon, and Alice watched from the study window as her stepmother stepped down, composed and elegant as ever, clearly expecting to find a frightened, compliant girl still easily managed. She did not find one. Lady Beatrice was shown into the drawing room, where Marcus and Alice were already seated, and her bright, practiced smile faltered only slightly at finding the Duke present for what she had clearly expected to be a private conversation with her stepdaughter alone. "Your Grace," she said smoothly, recovering, "how kind of you to receive me. I have come only to settle a small family matter with Alice. Nothing that need trouble your household." "Any matter concerning the Norwood Trust," Marcus said, "is very much my household's concern, Lady Beatrice, given that Miss Norwood presently resides under my roof, and I have taken a considerable personal interest in her welfare." Something flickered behind Lady Beatrice's composed expression. "I was not aware the arrangement had grown so familiar." "I have found Miss Norwood," Marcus said evenly, "to be a woman of considerable capability and character, qualities I understand you have spent 11 years actively concealing from her, along with, it appears, the true state of her own inheritance." Lady Beatrice's smile thinned. "I have managed that trust responsibly, Your Grace. Every expense drawn against it has been for Alice's own maintenance and upbringing." "Then you will have no objection," Alice said, her voice steadier than she had expected, her hands folded still in her lap, rather than nervously counting beneath the table, "to my solicitor, reviewing the trust's full accounting, alongside my father's original letter of intent, which describes considerably more generous provisions than I have ever been permitted to know existed." Lady Beatrice's composure, cultivated across 11 careful years, showed its first genuine crack. "Your father's letter carries no legal standing, Alice. Whatever sentimental value you attach to it, it carries considerable weight," Marcus interrupted. "When set alongside a trust document, your own solicitor is required, by law, to have registered with the county court at the time of your husband's death. A document I took the liberty of requesting a copy of myself, once Miss Norwood shared her concerns with me." He set a folded paper on the table between them. Lady Beatrice stared at it, and Alice watched. For the first time in 11 years, the particular satisfaction of seeing her stepmother's carefully maintained composure fail entirely. "The original trust," Marcus continued, "provided for a considerably larger sum than the one you have represented to Miss Norwood these past 11 years, along with an annual maintenance allowance that appears, upon comparison with your own household's expenditures, to have been drawn in full each year. while Miss Norwood herself was, by her own account, and by the state in which she arrived at my door, kept on considerably less than a fraction of what was actually allotted for her care. "This is a private family matter," Lady Beatrice said, her voice tightening. "It became my household's matter," Alice said, finding to her own quiet astonishment that her voice did not shake at all. "The moment you wrote asking me to sign away a portion of an inheritance you spent 11 years telling me did not exist, having quietly drawn its full maintenance allowance for yourself the entire time. You called me worthless more times than I can count, madam, while living, in part, on money meant for my own care." Lady Beatrice looked between Alice and Marcus, searching, Alice understood, for some remaining leverage, and finding none. "I raised you," she said finally, weakly. "Whatever you believe of my management, I raised you. You housed me," Alice said quietly. "There is a difference, madam, and I have only recently learned to understand it." Lady Beatrice left within the hour, her composure in tatters, and the matter of the trust was settled formally through Marcus's own solicitor in the weeks that followed, the full accounting produced, the discrepancy in 11 years of maintenance funds acknowledged, and a portion restored to Alice's name that neither she nor her stepmother had ever previously admitted existed at all. Winter deepened at Thistlewood, and the household settled into a rhythm Alice had never once known in her stepmother's house. Mornings with Lady Prudence, whose sharp affection for her had grown, over the months, into something Alice recognized, with quiet astonishment, as genuine family regard. Afternoons in the study, where her corrections to the estate's accounts had become simply the way the ledgers were kept, no longer offered tentatively, but given and received as a matter of course. Evenings at a table where the empty chair remained set, still, every single night, though it no longer carried quite the same weight of grief it once had. It was on a bright, cold evening in February that Marcus found her in the small library, the same room where they had first spoken plainly of the things that had shaped them both, and sat down across from her with the particular careful deliberateness she had come to recognize as the shape he wore before saying something that mattered. "I have been thinking," he said, "about that chair, the one you keep set every night." "Yes," he was quiet a moment. "I kept it, all these years, for anyone the world called worthless, hoping, I think, that keeping it might somehow undo what I failed to do for Eleanor. But I find, since you arrived, that the chair no longer feels like penance. It feels, instead, like the very habit that meant a warm seat was waiting the night you needed one most." "I did not arrive too late," Alice said softly, echoing something she had thought many times in the months since her arrival. "I arrived exactly when I needed to. I would like," Marcus said, "for that chair to stop being empty, Alice. Not because the habit was wrong to keep. I think I will always keep a place set for anyone the world has decided to discard. But I find I do not wish for the chair beside me, at the head of this table, to remain empty any longer. I find I wish it to be yours, properly, permanently, if you would have it." Alice looked at this man who had kept a seat warm for a stranger before he had any reason to, who had listened to 11 years of quiet cruelty without flinching from a single word of it, who had sat across from her stepmother and dismantled, calmly and precisely, a lie that had defined the whole of Alice's life until this winter. "I have spent 11 years being told I was worthless," she said, "by someone who benefited considerably from my believing it. I find I do not wish to owe my worth to anyone else's declaration of it either, Marcus, not even yours, however kindly meant. I am not offering to declare your worth," he said gently. I am asking you to sit at a table where your worth was never in question to begin with, and choose, freely, whether you wish to stay there for the rest of your life. Alice considered that, and found, for the first time in 11 long years, that the choice was entirely her own to make. Then yes, she said, I choose the chair, Marcus. I choose you. They married that spring, in the small chapel at the edge of the Thistlewood estate, with Lady Prudence insisting, over Mrs. Aldous' gentle protests, on being wheeled down the aisle herself, rather than missing a single moment of the ceremony, and Priscilla, who had written, quietly, some weeks before, asking with unexpected humility whether she might be permitted to attend, having finally understood something of what her mother's years of careful cruelty had actually cost, stood among the small gathering of guests, watching her stepsister marry a duke with an expression that held, for the first time in either of their lives, something like genuine respect rather than dismissal. By the following winter, Thistlewood's dining table still held its extra place setting each evening, though the household had come, gently, to understand it now as tradition rather than grief, a standing invitation, Marcus liked to say, to anyone the world had been too careless to properly see. Lady Beatrice wrote twice that year, each letter answered briefly and civilly by Alice herself. Neither cruelty nor reconciliation offered in return, simply the plain, settled clarity of a woman who had finally learned, at Thistlewood's table, exactly what she was worth. Her stepmother called her worthless for 11 years. The Duke kept her chair warm before he even knew her name, and he never once let anyone doubt what she was worth again. If this one held you the way it held me, comment the empty chair below. And if you've ever been called worthless by someone who benefited from you believing it, tell us about it, and tell us where you're watching from. Hit subscribe. The next story is already waiting.